All right. A very warm welcome to you all to the fifth event of our Publishing Critical Work PDW event. So this PDW series is part of our mission, part of CMS InTouch's mission to connect, support, and nurture the international CMS community online across the physical and spatial boundaries. In this series, we have interactive developmental online events for critical scholars who are interested in learning how to publish critical work in different outlets. And today, we are really delighted to have the journal Leadership with us, particularly. Leadership is perhaps the only dedicated journal in the field of leadership which encourages critical work. So we are sure that many of you would have read the journal, and we encourage more of you to check out the journal for lots of interesting work that's published. With that, please join me in welcoming Dennis and Donna. Dennis is the editor of Leadership, and Donna is the reviews editor of Leadership. A very warm welcome to Dennis and Donna. Over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Vijayda, for that lovely introduction. And Donna and I are delighted to be here at this event and to share information about our journal with all of you who are participating. So I'm Dennis Tourish. I'm the editor of the journal, originally from Northern Ireland. Donna Ladkin is our reviews editor, originally Donna from the United States, back there at the moment. And we will be giving you some information about the journal, but what we look for in submissions and so on. And Donna will be talking about a few issues towards the end about, for example, what we are now launching in terms of book reviews and inviting thoughts and suggestions from you about what we should do differently. So the journal Leadership has been around since 2005, when it was founded by David Collinson and Keith Grint. There's a shot of its web page, and there's a link to the web page below, as well as to our Twitter account, which Leah Tompkins, our social media editor, runs, and I know that Leah has tuned in here today as well. So a copy of these slides has been sent and can be circulated to anyone who wishes it on request, I think, to Alex. So here are some useful contacts for the journal as well as myself. I'm at the University of Sussex Business School. My surname is a bit unusual, so I'm easy to find if you want to track me down with any questions about the journal. Donna's email address is there too, from Antioch University, and Leah at the Open University. And I've also identified our current roster of associate editors who play a very important role in promoting and working for the journal. So I wanted to say something at the beginning about what is our unique critical selling point, because it was just mentioned that we're the only specifically leadership journal that goes out of its way to encourage critical contributions. And that's because the journal was founded in the teeth of a fairly stifling orthodoxy about leadership, which is very functionalist, very positivist, and very romantic in what it projects leadership as being about and what leaders can do. In the mainstream view of leadership, leaders are depicted something like this: miracle workers, superheroes who can transform anything very quickly. And this is a little cover from the front of Harvard Business Review a number of years ago, in which a male CEO is doing press-ups on the boardroom table, which sums it all up. Not just everything else, but also a very macho view of leadership, it has to be said. And this is the mainstream, you know, lots and lots of articles uncritically reproducing these myths of leadership, about how wonderful transformational leadership is, or authentic leadership, or any one of 101 other varieties of it that constantly proliferate. And it has to be said that it's difficult to publish critical empirical work in outlets like Leadership Quarterly, because they do take a rather different, and I would say very limited, view of what constitutes science. And unless you can produce what they consider to be scientific work, then empirical work most definitely will not be welcomed in those outlets. Now, by contrast, our guidelines for authors stress that we are particularly interested and critical approaches to leadership. We have always made it clear that we don't expect every paper to explicitly embrace a critical approach, but we do expect them to at least engage with the critical literature. And it does appear that for mainstream scholars that is very difficult, because most of them don't engage with the critical literature at all. They just completely ignore it, which is remarkable. Whereas almost by definition, critical scholars have to agree with the mainstream work. So as we say in these guidelines, if papers are submitted that fail to take the relevant critical literature into account, they will be rejected. And in fact, I desk reject all of those kinds of papers as a matter of course, as I will say in a moment. So we're looking for papers that engage with what you might describe as critical leadership studies. That is, papers that interrogate notions of power within leadership, that challenge the heroic and romanticized views of leadership that constitute the mainstream, that use, for example, different methodologies, such as interesting case studies, ethnographies, and so on. But papers that just ask really interesting questions about challenging or really interesting topics. For example, the forthcoming issue of the journal has a paper that I love. Some of you may remember a number of years ago, there was a mining disaster in Chile, where I forget the number, but a lot of Chilean miners were trapped underground for many weeks. And a couple of Chilean academics have written a lovely paper about the leadership dynamics that developed among that group during that long period that went by before, thankfully, they were rescued at the end. So it's different, it's novel, it's inherently interesting on a human scale as well as in terms of theory and everything else. And it's those kinds of papers that we greatly welcome. Some figures about the journal about our submission and acceptance rates. And I only got the figures for 2020 the other day. And you can see a pattern here of a steadily rising number of submissions to the journal, 346 in 2020, of whom ultimately 15 were accepted. And it's a rejection rate of around about 6%. But although that sounds forbidding, I'll explain something about it in just a moment that makes it less so. My own guesstimate is that around about 80% of submissions are desk rejected, maybe slightly more. And that leads into, well, why is it that we have such a low acceptance rate when we get such a high volume of submissions? Oh yeah, and the turnaround time for first decisions is around 20 days, so we're pretty quick in the great scheme of things. The main single reason for rejections is this, that although we are a critically orientated journal and insist that every paper must at least engage with the critical literature, the overwhelming majority of the submissions to us do not do so. So they're instantly desk rejected. So we get a lot of papers along the lines of, here are more findings in support of transformational leadership, which probably have been submitted to Leadership Quarterly and rejected by them, and then come to us for the simple reason that the authors of these papers haven't read the guidelines on our webpage. So that helps to explain our low acceptance rate. It's just that they're utterly out of kilter with the unique remit of the journal. A secondary reason why papers end up being desk rejected, actually, is that they utterly ignore leadership. Yes, really, they do. We get papers on things like supply chain management, a number of papers recently about COVID, some papers about marketing, which has a vague relationship to management in the eyes of the authors. But really, they ignore leadership as a phenomenon, either directly or else indirectly, in the sense that they do not engage with any of the theories of leadership or the leadership academic literature at all. I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it? To me, anyway. I always thought that everybody would have enough sense to read the guidelines for a journal before they send in papers, but many authors do not, thereby wasting their time and wasting ours. Other papers end up just repeating, what is already known without advancing on it. That's a common complaint, I think, across the spectrum of journal editors. And then some others offer a rather weak justification for the study in question. So I hope that puts our rejection rate in perspective. And I thought I would give you an example of the last kind of weak justification. This is from a rejection letter I wrote quite a while ago now about a paper that came in on charismatic leadership behavior. And the only rationale offered for it was that it hadn't been extensively studied in a particular country. The findings of the paper, by the way, ultimately concluded that yes, what we thought we knew about charismatic leadership based on studies elsewhere is reproduced in this country. So, yep, we're the same as other research has already established. And I tried to explain here that this is a weak justification, that the issue may not have been studied in depth in a whole variety of other countries, but we need some problematization of theory or some substantive identification of an important gap in our knowledge to show why studying it in a different cultural context might yield fresh insights. Without that, we end up with statements like this sign of the blindingly obvious, you know, sidewalk ends, who would have thought it, or caution, there's water on the road during rain. So before I hand over to Donna, let me just sum up what I have said here. Criticality is vital for submissions to the journal. I'm happy to explore in the questions and answers section of this session what we mean by that in more detail if it is insufficiently clear. Yes, we do have a high rejection rate, but it is, and it's higher than I would like, but it's purely because of the complete inappropriateness of many of the submissions that we receive. So we'll now hand over to my good colleague, Donna, and I'm her charming assistant here doing slides for her. So Donna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It was astonishing to me to see that when we saw the figures for our rejection rate. I found that quite astonishing myself, but it is, I can see it so clearly in terms of if people haven't read the guidelines about what we're looking for in the journal, why that is so. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives I'm trying to support through my role as reviews editor. And before I start talking about the book reviews, I'd just like to speak for a minute about, because initially when I took on the role of reviews editor, it was actually to look at papers that came in that were actually reviews of the literature. You know, we all as academics turn to good literature reviews when we're starting out on to explore a particular topic area. And so I took on the role of trying to nurture not book reviews, but actually literature reviews as they came in. And just to say a couple of things about that, we're still very keen to have reviews of literature come into the journal. But just as Dennis said, they, like the rest of the articles that we look at for the journal, need to be coming at the literature review from a critical perspective. So many students, when they finish their PhD, you know, one of the first publications that you try to get is you try to publish your book, your literature review. And I often see literature reviews that come through and I said, this is a literature review from a dissertation. It's not actually a literature review that is for a journal article. And for me, the difference is for a journal article, you really need to be engaging with the literature in a way that shows an argument coming through. So it's not just a review, you're actually building an argument. And in particular with literature reviews, for the journal, what we're keen to see is reviews that maybe take an alternative view of literature. They take a view, it's not just reporting what the literature is, but it may be looking at it from a different perspective. So for instance, you might want to review, I know Dennis has written a lot about transformational leadership and some of the problems with it, but you might want to review transformational leadership, but coming at it from, for instance, a feminist perspective, or looking at it from a critical race perspective, actually taking a different perspective on a body of literature that seeks to reveal particularly some of the hidden power dynamics that might be in existence in that literature. Dennis, did you want to add anything there? I see that you just come on my screen. I don't know if that's because you want to add something.
No.
You just
Maybe I should turn off my camera then if I
No, I don't think so. It's nice to see you.
Okay.
So basically, if you want to send in a literature review, we're very, very keen to see those come through. And just as Dennis has said about journal articles more generally, those reviews need to take a particular argument. They need to be forming a particular argument, and especially arguments which are critical in their perspective or orientation. Now, looking at the more sort of general way in which reviews editors are usually seen is around book reviews. And we have decided to reinstate book reviews into the journal. So we've not had book reviews.
Donna, you muted yourself there.
Thank you. I don't know how that's. So I'm talking about the book reviews. We have decided to reinstate book reviews into the journal. Which means that if you have read an interesting book on leadership and would like to review it and send it in, then please do so. However, we are being selective in the kinds of books that we want to review. So we want to use this forum to provide an important format for developing thoughts and arguments. So once again, we're talking about this from a scholarly perspective. So what are the key arguments out there in the scholarly world of leadership studies that are being put together in books that you'd like to talk about? I think it's really important to say something about bringing back books. I know there's so much pressure on especially young academics nowadays to write journal articles. That seems to be, that's the gold standard publication to be looking for in many of the academic contexts in which we work. But, I was remembering back to my young days when I had just, was starting to become an academic. And back then, books were still really valuable. And I remember reading, books from cover to cover. And I loved seeing how arguments could be developed over the course of a book, and how you could really get into ideas in quite a lot of depth in ways that you really can't do with journal articles. So by bringing back book reviews, I think we're both kind of falling in line with some other journals that look at that do publish book reviews, but also I think we are reasserting the importance of books as a format, and how we want to look at those ideas that can be offered in books and how they can be critically reviewed. So we are looking for books of what we call scholarly content, sort of, how would I describe scholarly? Something that has been tested empirically, something that builds on literature, not the hundreds of books each year which get published under the sort of title of 10 tips of successful leaders, or how I saved this particular company all by myself in 6 months, that kind of thing. So we really are looking at more scholarly content rather than the many sort of airport books on how to be a great leader that would fall in line with the pictures that Dennis showed earlier on about the Harvard Business Review CEO doing press ups on his board table. And along with that, so books of scholarly content, again, to review them with a critical edge. So, and here, we're looking for new titles, things that have been published, within the last couple of years. But also what I like to see in the book reviews is also engagement with some of the older titles, maybe even some of the chestnuts of leadership scholarship, but bringing a new edge to them. So again, looking at a book like Bernard Bass's transformational leadership book, or even James Burns' leadership book, and looking at that with a different theoretical lens. What would that look like from a feminist perspective, for instance? What would it look like if we actually really unpicked the power dynamics that book just assumes? So that sort of thing we'd be really interested to see. Dennis, could I have the next slide, please?
Yes.
Thank you. I think we see the book reviews as serving the purpose of making leadership relevant through public conversations. So what we really want to do is we want to be looking at issues that are currently in our times that leaders are dealing with and engaging with them in a scholarly and critical fashion. And I think, can I just say, I think one of the things that Dennis has been just excellent at in terms of his role as editor-in-chief is that, when something is happening like COVID, he actually pushes forward to say, let's get a special issue on leadership in COVID. And so we had a special issue, come out very recently about COVID, which is up-to-date thinking about what was going on in terms of leadership through the pandemic, which of course we're still all dealing with. In the wake of the worldwide protests against police violence towards people of color, both in the United States and throughout the world, there was a special issue, which again was published very quickly on race and leadership. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about the journal is that whereas many journal articles, even once you get them published online, which they will come out quite quickly now, but it can take years before an article is actually published in hard copy. And also the reviewing process is often such that it can take years before material can get through. So, there may be something happening in leadership that's really important, but you don't get anything published about it for years on afterwards. Whereas I think what Dennis has really pushed through with the journal is trying to get us to be very responsive to what is going on in the environment from a leadership perspective and writing about it, because that makes us relevant. I was just thinking the other day, there should be an article written about Mark Zuckerman and Facebook and what they're trying to do in terms of, the decision they have to make as to whether or not to continue to ban Donald Trump from publishing things on Facebook. I mean, that's a real, what's Mark Zuckerman's life like as he tries to contemplate that. So, to pick up issues of relevance right here and now, I think is one of the things that Dennis has really pushed and which the journal has acted on in these particular issues. And we're always looking for new ideas from people about special issues that you see as important that you'd like to edit. So, I think Dennis is always really welcoming of those kinds of ideas. And the other big thing that we've done recently is to bring on Leah Tompkins, who has joined us as our social media editor. And she has got us a Twitter account. So we have now we have joined the 21st century in terms of social media presence, thanks to Leah. And I think she too is always interested in ideas about, what we should be thinking about to be relevant in terms of public conversations. So I think those are the things that I wanted to cover. And I think, Dennis, if you just want to go to the last slide, the question is, we'd like to hear more from you. And I hope there's some questions in the question and answer box, but also some suggestions from you about what you would like to be saying as part of the journal. So that's me done. I don't know what happens now.
Well, what happens now is we move into the discussion. So I think we stop sharing our screen and we have a little look if there's any. Alex has curated some of the questions.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so we can see that down here. So question one from Scott: does one have to engage with conventional leadership theories to be relevant here? Or is there a different way to be relevant and engage with leadership for your journal? I'm not sure that you have to absolutely engage with conventional theories to get enough publicity. The important thing is to have something different, novel and critical to say yourself. And as part of that, also, we're trying to encourage different forms of writing, by the way. For example, we published a paper last year, which I think Bert Spector had a dialogue, an imaginary dialogue with the deceased sociologist Alvin Gouldner, interrogating some of his past writings, as if Goulden was able to reply from his perspective. Stuff like that is quite good. Donna?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because for me, it makes me wonder what you mean by conventional leadership theories. And I think we are very much in favor of bringing what are considered to be non-conventional views and trying to bring them more into the center, because leadership is a phenomena that looks very different in different contexts. And so I think we do want to see things coming from other perspectives, very much so.
Okay.
I think the problem can be, finding when you're building your argument, how you actually, show how you're positioning what you're doing. But there are papers, there is literature out there to be mined. So I think we really do welcome the mining of new literatures in this area as well.
Great. We have a question from Shoaib. I apologize if I haven't pronounced your name properly, saying, are you open to Eastern, more holistic views of leadership? My first thought is yes and no, in that sometimes we get papers submitted which, to take a sort of a semi-fictitious example, might say something like, here is a Muslim perspective on leadership or a Hindu perspective on leadership. And it's completely critical in that it just says, here's a brilliant new model for developing people in leadership roles that should be more widely applied. That's not a particularly critical approach in my view. So it's not enough, I think, just to draw from a philosophical tradition from elsewhere. Just like I don't think it's enough for Western scholars to draw on a dead French philosopher and uncritically say this is a brilliant way to do leadership. I wouldn't be very open to that either. Donna?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I see this not only in this journal, but in other journals which I review for, where there will be a perspective coming from the East, which is promoting a more kind of holistic idea, but isn't. And I really am welcoming that, but there also needs to be the critical foundations behind that, and the argument. It needs to be going somewhere as well. So it can't be just, oh, this is a new idea coming from here. We have to see what is its utility theoretically or practically, and how, what is the purpose that it serves that isn't being served by other theories. You still have to position it in a scholarly way. So I think I'm always keen to see those, but I'm also keen to see them positioned so that we can clearly see what the contribution is.
I mean, for example, some of the papers along these lines that have been submitted to the journal that I have seen manage to introduce a perspective from the East, but totally ignore issues like power within organizations, or the fact that leaders and followers often have very differentiated interests, the kinds of questions that are fundamental for critical studies. So in my view, papers like that fall down in just the same way as the mainstream leadership literature does, and they wouldn't be suitable for us. Andrew asks, are we interested in leadership education issues? I would say yes, providing they're critical. If we get a paper along the lines that the Vice Chancellor of our university is a brilliant man, it would usually be a man, and here are 6 successful initiatives he's undertaken, and we have received papers like that. Well, no, they will be excluded, not because they deal with leadership education, but because they're uncritical.
Yeah, there have been some wonderful, Bridget Carroll, who's also one of our associate editors, has written some wonderful work about, for instance, the oppression of leadership development programs, which all want to put us in the same boxes in terms of you need to look like this, and I think that kind of work we're very interested to see, things that take some of our taken for granted notions about leadership education, that it's so wonderful, and actually ask us to think about the assumptions that go into leadership development programs, and ask us to take into account both the benefits of those things, but also some of the more problematic aspects of them. I remember, I think Nancy Harding has done some wonderful work looking at, especially in terms of authentic leadership, and this whole idea of how can we actually develop authentic leaders, because that's a kind of oxymoron in a way, because if you're being authentic, how do you do that in a way that's not done in a cookie cutter fashion? So I think she's looked at that. So I think we have some good examples of people who have dealt with leadership development from a more critical perspective, and I think there's still more work to be done in that area.
Okay, Shah Begin asks if historical methodologies are accepted in this journal. I don't quite know what you mean about historical methodologies, but we are definitely interested in historical approaches to leadership. And we have published some really interesting papers looking at things in the past. Paul Sanders wrote a brilliant article a couple of years ago called Dirty Hands in Leadership, looking at the role of some Jewish leaders in Hungary in 1944 when confronted with the Holocaust, for example. So what that reflects also is that we're not just interested in business leadership, far from it. I would greatly welcome more leadership on historical issues and on political issues. And we had a special issue also on post-truth leadership a while ago that reflects that. So it's really, in my view, important to broaden the whole subject of leadership out to encompass multiple different areas. And I think that humanities, for example, has a lot to offer us in this respect. Leadership in the humanities, we need more work on that. Donna?
No, I would just concur with everything you said.
So Alex has asked, then, are we interested in interdisciplinary studies? And building on what I just said, the answer would clearly be yes. The more interdisciplinary, the better. The qualification is always that they must adopt a critical perspective. But yeah, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, that would be welcome.
Yeah. I guess I would just add to that. I mean, I just see leadership as an interdisciplinary area itself. I mean, because leadership, has, as a phenomenon, has been looked at by people from different perspectives: psychological, sociological, philosophical, anthropological. So for me, leadership itself is an interdisciplinary phenomena, and so we need to come at it from interdisciplinary perspectives. So certainly, yeah.
Great. And Alex's question 6 from Mark. Okay, I missed that, but Mark is looking for anybody interested in conducting a critical review of leadership textbooks. That would be a wonderful project, and certainly I think the journal would welcome a contribution along those lines. So anybody interested in working with Mark on that should get in touch. Deborah wants to know how we recruit reviewers for leadership. Well, we use the Manuscript Central system, which has a catalogue of people who have reviewed for the journal in the past or who have expertise in particular areas. And in line with that, we draw reviewers from our editorial board or from people whose work is important to a particular paper that has been submitted. But Deborah, if you're not currently reviewing for the journal and you're interested in doing so, then please drop me an email indicating your area of expertise, and I will gladly add you to the roster. I mean, I don't know if other journals are finding this, but I'm finding it increasingly difficult to get people to review for the journal. I suspect it's bound up with the increased work intensification of academic life, but we always need new good reviewers.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Deborah, please send me your email address. But, reviewing, I mean, it's a labor of love, reviewing, but also increasingly I'm inviting younger scholars to review, because I think you learn so much when you review. Because you learn so much about when you are looking critically at a paper, you learn a lot about how to create your own journal article. So I think it can be a really developmental process, actually reviewing other people's work. So I encourage I know there's so much work, but I do think it can help in your own, endeavor to be published yourself by looking at other people's work.
Alex has posed a question, something about, as a follow-up to Andrew's previous question about education. I was thinking along the lines of the challenges of getting more students interested in leadership. I'm not sure I understand the question, Alex. Would you like to pop in here and tell us what you mean by that? Or maybe not.
Dennis, I think it's just a follow up from Andrew's earlier question, which was question 3, where Andrew asked, are you interested in leadership education issues? So I think you responded to that, and I think that Andrew is just clarifying that he is interested in terms of the challenges in getting students interested in leadership. I think that was probably just clarification.
Well, yeah, I mean, critically orientated papers dealing with that also would be welcome. It's yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, as long as it's got a critical edge to it, you know, I think that we're very open as a journal to almost anything connected with leadership.
I guess from a critical perspective, I would be asking the question, why do we want to do that?
Or maybe the question, Donna, is getting students critically interested in leadership.
Yeah, maybe that would
be a thing. And I mean, I find with students a very divided attitude. Some of them just want the top 10 tips to be successful.
Yeah.
But also most of them who have had any experience, they also know that leadership is far more difficult than those prescriptions indicate. So I've had many really interesting critical discussions with MBA students about the challenges of leadership without any problem. Scott, interested in context-specific studies that look, say, at leadership in the professions critically, rather than assuming that the business as a whole, whatever that might mean. Yeah, that's a perfectly valid point. I'm sure you're quite right, Scott, that there are very many specific issues in these different professional contexts. I know that some of the leading business schools in the States now, Harvard, I think, is a good example. They try to inject the development of leadership into every single course that they run. So one of the objectives of its dentistry program, for example, is to turn these people into leaders. There's a lot of very good questions that could be asked about that.
Yeah, but Scott, I really like that question too, because for instance, one of the things that breaks my heart is when I see, so at Antioch, I'm involved with a lot of students who are doing leadership within areas of social justice, for instance. And when I look at ways of organizing and ways of leading for social justice, they often, you know, business models, they don't work, you know. So I think it's really important that we're looking at leadership in these different contexts, and also looking at how leadership can look different in these different contexts. There was a really interesting article in the special issue on race that was looking at, for instance, Black Lives Matter, and how Black Lives Matter doesn't organize in the way as is traditionally thought in terms of having one leader. And they've been criticized for that. And yet what they're saying is, yes, but this is a different form of leadership that we're developing within this context. That's really important. So yeah, I think we need studies that look at leading in different contexts and how leading can look quite different.
Well, another question, question 10 from Marwa. What do you think about the perspectives of psychoanalysis in leadership studies? Does psychoanalysis play a major role in CMS? Are there areas that are understudied in connection to leadership and psychoanalysis? Well, there probably are areas that are understudied in leadership from that particular perspective. Yanis Gabriel, now retired, and Mark Stein, who's at Leicester, have written interesting pieces on different aspects of leadership and psychoanalysis. But again, I would say it's a question of using that perspective or any other perspective to advance a critical agenda, to ask critical questions, to face up to issues of power and relational dynamics within the workplace, within politics, within society, or elsewhere. And I'm sure that we could have more material from a psychoanalytic perspective that does that. We had one of the best papers on authentic leadership was one by Jackie Ford and Nancy Harding a number of years ago that took what they called an object relations approach to the idea of authenticity and leadership. So that's maybe an example of something along those lines that we have published. But Marwa, if you have ideas for more work along those lines, please send them. Donna?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, and another question from Sheila. Are we very rigid about word count and page count? Well, no, we're not absolutely rigid about this. The general guideline, I think, is around about 10,000 words. The one thing that I do increasingly pick up upon is that we get a number of papers that contain too many references. You know, a third or more of a paper that has a list of references is weak, I think, because it means that you're citing lots of studies but not really engaging with them in any particular depth. And usually we can accomplish a great deal of interesting work around about the 10,000 word limit. Nobody wants to read a 15,000 word paper as a general rule, but it's a case by case process. It would be silly, I think, to be absolutely rigid about it.
Yeah. Yes, and also if you're looking at articles that are using different methods, if you're looking at, you know, methods like narrative methods and ethnographic methods, case study methods, you know, those tend to take up more words, and they're really important. You know, if you're doing a textual analysis, that can use more words. So yeah.
It occurs to me just to say as well that and another thing which I'm trying to do in the journal is that I think that sometimes the review process has gone on too long and through too many rounds. So we're increasingly trying to take a decision on principle after two rounds of revision, which I think is plenty from that. One other comment, not directly related to this, because Alex has noted here that we have no further questions at the moment. I would like to flag the fact that we have an international studying leadership conference each year in December, which is closely associated with the journal. It's a relatively small conference of 100, 150 people. It's been held in a number of different places, Lancaster, Copenhagen, in Australia, America, and various other places. This year it's going to be held online for obvious reasons. And information about it, I think, is now on our website and will be appearing with the next issue of the journal, which will be out in a few weeks. So as a way of connecting with fellow critical leadership scholars and finding out more about the journal and so on, it would be useful to look that up and come on. Leah has posted something. Alex, would you like to just mention that you're Leah? Yeah, it's from Leah. Leah, would you like to just pop up and say something about your role as social media editor and maybe pose that issue that you've just posted as a question?
I'm not sure if she can. Oh, Alex is talking about if she can. I'm not sure she can.
You should be able to unmute, I would have thought, and come on video, Leah, but maybe not. Anyway, a plea from Leah as well to use accessible language, not dumbing down, but accessible, and abstracts of papers and so on, because she says that if it's incomprehensible to her, she won't be able to generate any real interest on social media, which I think is a perfectly valid point and one that I personally feel very strongly about. I think that a lot of our scholarship in the management and organization studies field in general is a lot of pretentious drivel, quite frankly, as people go out of their way to be obscure in order to create the impression that they're developing theory when in fact they aren't doing any such thing. So there's a lot to be said for clarity of exposition. And I must actually confess that I have rejected some papers for the journal on the basis that I don't understand what they're on about. And if I don't understand it, it's unlikely that many other people will understand it as well. So yeah, clarity of exposition is a really good point.
Leah, you should be able to talk now. So
yes, I have. I've been unmuted. Thank you. No, I mean, exactly as Dennis has said, and in connection with what Donna was saying about, you know, the relevance to the public conversation and public events. You know, most of the time when we have opportunities to contribute to the public conversation about leadership, it's in connection with something happening quickly, some big event, and we have to be able to respond with speed and clarity. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had to translate really great academic work into what I sometimes call human being speak, to be able to generate this broader interest. And I don't mean that we should be dumbing down the arguments, but the, you know, playing them through the prism of, you know, would my best friend understand this? Would my father understand it? Just helps us to join the conversation with language and concepts that other people understand, and that's what we're trying to do with the social media presence. So, as I say in my question, please help me to help you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really good point. And also, I want to thank you, Leah, for your work you've been doing on the social media role, which is great. And you know, it's interesting the impact all this can have. The special issue on leadership and coronavirus crisis, for example, the papers in that have had thousands of downloads and views. Some of them astonishing, 30, 40, 50,000 views and the like. Some of it driven by social media and elsewhere. So publishing in the journal is a good way of drawing attention to your work, especially with Leah's help on social media. And I think we might be out of questions, plumb out of questions, unless anybody has a last thing to throw at us. And if not, maybe Kat would like to take over and wind us to a conclusion.
I guess before we go, because in the previous series we've had a lot of interest about the kind of growing social media presence. So if possible, and we've got time, it might be really interesting to hear a bit more from Leah in terms of what would be useful from you. So if Leah, if you'd be happy to put off your camera or even just on mic to talk about that, and then I think we've actually got another question after that. Would that be okay, Leah?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Although, so my unmade up self wasn't quite ready for this.
I'm not wearing any makeup either.
Oh, but Dennis, you and I had a pact. Yes, I mean, as many people on this call know, our adventures with social media are relatively new, and in fact, the special issue to which both Dennis and Donna referred on the coronavirus was kind of a prompt to get involved in that, because I was writing about difficult leadership issues around that period, as were many others. And I was finding it difficult to get institutional support to publicize this, despite their calls for thought leadership. What I discovered was that the thought leadership they were after was not, as in Dennis's language, very critical. And therefore it was almost impossible to write or say something that was relevant and punchy and interesting and critical. And that's when, in discussion with Dennis, we decided to try and do something about that. So we're on quite a steep learning curve about what does generate and what doesn't generate much interest. We're slowly building our followership, our readership. I don't even know what the terminology is for people who follow us on Twitter. So we're building steadily. And as well as what I was saying about the accessible language, because as I say, if I struggle to get through the abstract of a new paper, I can't do anything other than repeat the language of the paper. So it doesn't go anywhere. But the other thing is that just the topics that attract interest are the controversial ones. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage you to be bold and courageous about tackling difficult issues, as well as the special issue around COVID. The papers in the journal that have flown on social media, most of them were the ones in the special issue on race. And they attracted a phenomenal amount of interest and sort of ripple effect. And it really made me realize that actually social media is a platform for us to have courage. I don't mean unqualified courage. I don't mean, risk of getting into any kind of trouble, but even more than the journal papers themselves, say something that makes a difference. Say something that makes people wake up and go, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about it like that. And the more you can do that, the more we can really get some energy around the social media conversation.
Quite agree. Those are very good points, Leah. We have another question. Somebody, I think, is it Scott, has asked about dead French philosophers. Are we allowed, say, to take political philosophers, dead or otherwise, and seek to introduce a critical, political, or even actionist view into leadership and context? And the answer, of course, is yes. I was being a little bit satirical when I mentioned dead French philosophers, because sometimes in our academic articles, they're used as a crutch rather than as a means to aid understanding. And their ideas are presented in the most obscure form imaginable. But I would say, as long as you're adopting a critical approach, we welcome all kinds of perspectives and insights drawn from almost any particular quarter as well.
Of course, we learned how to be critical from dead French philosophers.
Yeah, we did.
They are, the critical movement, really started, well, Foucault was one of the first very important critical voices. So I think we could learn from dead French philosophers about what it does mean to be critical.
Absolutely. It's just that sometimes in some papers, it's an excursion into pretentiousness.
I agree. I completely agree.
It's used to camouflage the lack of insight rather than to illuminate it, and I don't think that's helpful.
Yes, exactly. I agree with you. Yeah.
As we come near to the end of the time, I wanted to mention as well, Donna asked earlier if anybody had any suggestions for the journal, either of topics that we should cover that we haven't, or special issues or anything else. And, in the aftermath of this session, to those of you who've turned up, please think about this. I hope that I will see at least some of you at the ISLC conference online in December. But in the meantime, if you do have issues or ideas about the journal, drop us a line, please. And there's nothing else on the chat that I can see. So, Kat, are you the one running the show at the moment? Yeah.
All right. Yes, with that, we come to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Dennis and Donna, for the fantastic session, and Leah, to you as well for joining us and providing great insights. And I'm sure, like, all of us have got better clarity of, how to publish our critical work in leadership, how to prepare our submissions, and what is it that the journal looks for in the submissions. Thanks so much. And I would also like to thank all the attendees for their time, for great questions posed, as well as their participation. As part of promotion of our upcoming events of CMS InTouch, we would like to draw your attention to our forthcoming events. On 8th of June, we have publishing critical work in the Journal of Business Ethics. And in July, 5th of July, we have publishing critical work in organization studies. And we invite you to join these sessions as well. And if any one of you is interested in running your own CMS InTouch webinar, like there was a question or a suggestion of a workshop in the Q&A section. If there's interest to have that kind of session among the attendees, you're more than welcome to write to us. You can write to us on this email ID, cmswebinars@gmail.com. All right, so that's all for now. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
And thank you to those who organized this event. It was just great for us, for the journal. And I know Donna and I and Leah all appreciated the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.